former Governor John Hickenlooper, former Speaker of the Colorado House Andrew Romanoff, both hoping to win this month's Democratic primary, and unseat Republican Senator Cory Gardner this fall. Tonight, Denver 7, the Denver Post, Colorado Public Radio, and the University of Denver present the only in-person debate of the primary election cycle. And now live from the Denver 7 studios, our moderator, Ann Trujillo.
And good evening, and thank you for joining me tonight. Over the next 90 minutes, we will be covering a wide range of topics, and these two men will tell you where they stand on issues that matter to you, and they will explain why they deserve your vote. Now, first, the rules. Each candidate will get 60 seconds to answer each question. If there is a need for a follow-up, the candidate will get 30 seconds to respond. We will be on air for the next 60 minutes with one 3-minute break, and then you can join us on CPR News, the Denver Post, or the Denver 7 streaming platforms for the final 30 minutes. All right, we are all in the Denver 7 studio tonight, paying very careful attention to social distancing. Mr. Hickenlooper and Mr. Romanoff, they are standing 6 feet apart from one another. I am seated 6 feet apart from both of tonight's panelists, Ryan Warner with Colorado Public Radio and Justin Wingirter from the Denver Post, and you will be hearing from them in just a moment. First, we want to get to the candidates. I want to ask how you will help Coloradans if elected senator. All right, we know Colorado's unemployment rate for April was 11.3%. We're waiting for new numbers on Friday. The pandemic isn't over. We have no vaccine. There's a concern a second wave could be coming this fall. So as senator, how will you bring our state and our country back to broad prosperity? And Governor Hickenlooper, we'll start with you.
Well, thanks so much for having us and hosting this debate. And certainly, I think it's important to first recognize that our essential workers and our first responders and our government, Governor Polis, have really done a great job. But we are going to have serious repercussions from the fact that, President Trump poo-pooed this, and we were unprepared. We didn't have capacity for testing. We didn't have tracing capacity. We didn't have protective equipment. So we've got to have all of that if we're going to reopen our economy. But we've also got to make sure that we are providing resources to the truly small businesses, because that's really what drives our economy here in Colorado and across the country. And that small business access to capital was not in the first CARES Act, and we've got to make sure that that is there. So first, we've got to make sure we can measure and stop any future outbreak of the virus, but then also we've got to make sure that small businesses get access to capital and resources.
Thank you. Now, same question to you, Mr. Romanoff. How will you bring our state and our country back to broad prosperity?
Well, one of the reasons that small businesses don't have access to the loans they need and the Paycheck Protection Program is because a lot of those benefits are concentrated at the very top. The nation's biggest businesses and biggest banks have an unholy alliance that leaves a lot of folks left holding the bag. So what I believe we ought to do is not only accelerate the development of a vaccine and a program of testing and tracing and isolation and treatment, but we got to make sure that when Congress provides relief, it aims those benefits at those of us in the middle and at the bottom, the struggling Americans and small businesses who are just trying to make ends meet and weather this storm. One of the other lessons we can draw from this pandemic is that my health depends on yours. We ought to fight with all our might to provide a system of universal health care instead of allowing the broken model subsidized by the insurance industry and the politicians on its payroll to leave a quarter of the population uninsured or underinsured. That was never a great idea. During a pandemic, it's a disaster.
All right, thank you both, gentlemen. We want to get to questions from our panelists, so we're going to begin now with Ryan Warner.
Thanks, Ann. It occurs to me, gentlemen, that the policies we're going to hear about tonight may be pipe dreams if Democrats don't take back the Senate and the White House. And that's certainly not a guarantee. So I want to know how effective you'd be if you're in the minority. Pick an issue. Tell me how you would move the needle with Republicans. Mr. Romanoff.
Well, we just talked a little bit about healthcare, Ryan. And look, it is small businesses and families who are bearing the brunt of America's runaway healthcare costs. I've served in the minority before. In fact, I spent my first 4 years in the legislature before I led the team to our first majority in 30 years in the minority. And don't get me wrong, it was more fun to be in charge. But I was able to pass more legislation as a freshman legislator than any other member of the Democratic caucus. I don't want to kid you here. I was one of the most effective legislative leaders in America, but I'm not a magician. I can't get Mitch McConnell to magically change his spots and see the light. A better approach, in my view, is to ditch Mitch. There's a hashtag for that and an election for that in Kentucky. But when it comes to the cost of health care, I think we can forge an alliance between workers and businesses and recognize that America is paying too much for health care, twice as much as our competitors in other industrialized countries, and we're not getting outcomes that are twice as good. So I'd like to cut our medical bills in half and cover everyone and improve quality along the way. I think we can get from here to there.
Mr. Hickenlooper, this question of what you would do if you were in the minority, how you would move the needle on an issue you are passionate about.
Well, I do reject the premise in terms of we're going to beat Mitch McConnell, we're going to win the Senate, and we're going to defeat Donald Trump. But in the hypothetical, let me talk just a little bit. We started talking about how to rebuild the economy. And when I came in as governor in 2011, we were in one of the worst budget crunches and one of the worst recessions in a century. We went out to every county, all 64 counties, and we worked together. We were 40th in job creation, and we made a commitment that we were going to raise everyone up, not just the urban areas along the Front Range, but everyone. And we went from 40th in job creation to the #1 economy in the country, really through that collaborative effort. And so doing, we expanded healthcare. We were able to make real strides forward in climate change. But the collaborative spirit, which is the Colorado way, that's really what drove us to success.
All right, let's move on to questions from Justin Wingirter. Justin?
And we'll switch to healthcare, beginning with Mr. Hickenlooper. You've said on many occasions that you prefer adding a public option. Would your plan leave any Coloradans uninsured?
No, and I have said from the beginning of my adult life, when I helped start a community health center in 1973 in Middletown, Connecticut, healthcare is a right. It's not a privilege. And we've got to get to universal coverage. I think Barack Obama built a great legacy for this country in terms of the Affordable Care Act, but he didn't get to finish it. He designed it to be used with a public option. We didn't get to do that. We didn't get any of the improvements that he and his team had envisioned. Obviously, we've got to expand coverage. We also have to control cost. And we have to find a way to allow our government, alone among industrialized nations, to negotiate for bulk discounts for Medicare. We also have to look at how can we expand generic drugs and drive costs down that way as well. Transparency in clinics and hospitals. I mean, we've got to put all this together in a healthcare plan to control costs.
Mr. Romanoff, you prefer a Medicare for All plan. What would you say to those Coloradans who will lose the insurance that they get through their employer?
I've met a lot of Coloradans who liked their health insurance until they had to use it, and they found out it didn't actually cover what they thought. I led the fight for mental health care in Colorado, as you know, Justin, for the last 4 years as the president and CEO of Mental Health Colorado. And I've met so many folks across the state who have been devastated, not only by mental illness and drug addiction, but also by an industry that bases its profits on its ability to deny as many claims and exclude as many sick people as possible. That's the business model. And it is a great model if you're an insurance company. It's a pretty lousy model for the rest of us. So I don't want to wait for some slow evolution that eventually brings care to everyone. We need to act now. We have not only 28 million Americans uninsured and 44 million underinsured, 500,000 families in the richest nation on the face of the earth go bankrupt each year because they can't afford their medical bills. And at least 35,000 people in this nation are dying because they can't afford to see a doctor. That's immoral. It doesn't have to be this way, and it's not this way in other parts of the world.
All right, gentlemen, we want to ask each of you some quick questions to clarify your positions on several key issues. Both of you, please respond with a yes or no. We know in November, Coloradans will be asked to vote on several issues. So again, yes or no. Should Colorado prohibit abortion after 22 weeks of gestational age? Yes or no?
No.
No.
Should Colorado increase taxes on tobacco?
Yes.
Yes.
Do you support eliminating the Electoral College and electing the president by popular vote?
Yes.
I support popular vote, yes.
Electing the president by popular vote?
Yes.
Yes. Electoral College?
Well,
Eliminating
they're
the
tied
Electoral College?
I support the popular vote. The initiative doesn't, I don't think, doesn't.
Okay. Just wanted to clarify. Do you favor a ban on all assault weapons? Yes or no?
Yes.
Yes.
Would you support a U.S. Senate resolution to make Juneteenth a federal holiday?
Yes.
Yes.
Do you favor reparations as a way to address the wrongs of slavery in U.S. history?
Yes.
I support the study that's in the House, but definitely there have to be some sort of reparations.
All right. Let's get back to our panelists then. Thank you, gentlemen. Justin?
Thank you. There are calls from protesters to defund the police. What do those words mean to you, and what duties, if any, would you take away from police officers? I think Mr. Hickenlooper is up first.
Sure. And the real issue here in police reform is holding police officers accountable. When I first got elected mayor, I've talked a lot about Paul Childs, a 15-year-old African-American teenager who was shot in his own front hall. And I worked with the Ministerial Alliance to create Office of the Independent Monitor, Civilian Oversight Commission, crisis de-escalation training for every officer. We went a long way, but we did not go far enough. And we've got to hold officers accountable. We've got to move on to that next step of banning chokeholds, making sure every officer has to wear a body camera and keep it on. We've got to get rid of the no-knock raids. This is all part of a concerted effort that can't stop with police reform. We've got to look at the inequity in our society is in healthcare, housing, economic opportunity. We've got to address all of that.
Mr. Romanoff?
Well, we need to shift resources from law enforcement to community services, including mental health. I met with the sheriff up in Boulder, Joe Pelley, who said, I run the largest mental hospital in my community. It's called the county jail. That cannot be the right approach. Turning our jails and prisons into warehouses for people who face mental illness or drug addiction is the single most expensive and least therapeutic decision we could make. We also need to make sure we understand why this movement for Black Lives Matter is so urgent, rooted in centuries of oppression and discrimination. And it's not enough to say Black Lives Matter when every single day we act as if they don't. African Americans in this country are more than 2.5 times more likely to be killed by police officers than white Americans are. That's unacceptable, and it's why the murder of George Floyd is so painful, in part because it was not an isolated incident. I've laid out a plan at andrewromanoff.com to end police violence, including many of the steps we are going to talk about tonight. But it seems to me if we're serious about justice and equality for all, we ought to recognize we're nowhere near there yet.
Thank you, gentlemen. All right, Ryan, next batch of questions.
You mentioned George Floyd. The death of George Floyd has brought more attention to the police killings of people of color in Colorado. Think of Devon Bailey in Colorado Springs, Elijah McClain in Aurora. And I want to ask you each about the McClain case. The 23-year-old was walking home from the store, stopped by police, put in a hold, sedated, and then died. Should his case be reopened? And explain your thinking. Mr. Hickenlooper?
Don't we rotate back and forth on who goes first?
Mr. Romanoff?
Yes, it should be reopened. And look, this epidemic of brutality has persisted not just in recent years, but for centuries. The reason that so many Americans, I think, are finally waking up to these problems is in part because some of these murders have been captured now on video. So when it comes to ending police violence, I think we ought to hold officers accountable, create a national database of police misconduct, impose, as the state legislature is doing, a requirement on officers to intervene when other officers are committing misconduct, ban chokeholds and strangleholds, pursue consent decrees, and investigate rogue agencies that are violating civil rights laws. There's a federal obligation here, too. We can't simply rely on the good graces of an individual police agency or even a state government to solve this problem because we have allowed it to persist for too long.
And so to be very clear, you would reopen the McClain case?
That's correct.
Mr. Hickenlooper?
Yes, I would reopen the McClain case. I agree with everything that Andrew said, and I think that it is a question of accountability and how do we get there. And we have to ban chokeholds and strangleholds and make sure everyone has their camera turned on and ban no-knock raids. But we've got to get police officers accountable. And I support the bill that Kamala Harris, Senator Harris, has introduced. And I'm proud to say that she endorsed our campaign. But she talks about using a different definition of appropriate force. And we've always used reasonable force, which can be twisted into all sorts of situations to justify all kinds of actions. She's suggesting that we should use necessary force, And that allows us to really hold officers to a much stricter form of accountability and make sure that there are consequences that match their deeds.
Thank you both.
Very quickly, we wanted to ask, do you think it's a good idea for Colorado to have a statewide independent police monitor?
Yes, I do. Look, part of our plan, again, you can find the details at andrewromanoff.com, includes the formation of independent oversight bodies with the authority to hold police officers accountable. In some cases, that'll be conducted by at a local level, but I would support the same body existing at a state level.
And Mr. Hickenlooper?
Yes, you know, when I was mayor, we created one of the first offices of an independent monitor in the country. Not the first, but one of the first. And it clearly works. I think the Justice Department in Washington, one of the reasons I'm excited about going to Washington is to put some of these things into systemic enforcement. And having a statewide independent monitor makes tremendous sense, but only as it can help us get independent monitors in the communities where they're most needed.
Thank you. All right, gentlemen, why should people of color vote for you when you both have years as elected officials here in Colorado? How could you have better affected change over those years? Mr. Hickenlooper, you're first.
Yes, and I mentioned already that when I was elected and Paul Childs was shot in his front hall, he was holding a knife up as if it was a candle in church, and a Denver police officer shot him 4 times in the chest. As with Elijah McClain, no mother should ever have to go to the funeral of their child, and we took this seriously. We provided all types of alternative uses for police in their training. You know, I had a remarkable man, Al LeCabe, who was in the public safety. He'd grown up in the projects of New Orleans, and he worked at changing the discipline matrix. And we got there so that if someone lied about an incident, they could be fired first time. But we didn't get far enough, and I regret that to this day. On all those reform issues, we didn't get far enough at the time.
Thank you. Mr. Romanoff?
We wouldn't be here, John and Cory and I, if not for the privilege we hold. And we ought to recognize that the 3 finalists for the U.S. Senate all happen to be white men. It's no accident. It's in part because of America's original and persistent sin, the sin of racial injustice. The reason so many people of color have endorsed our campaign, including Tay Anderson, the Denver school board member who is leading the fight for racial justice here in Denver, and Crisanta Duran, the first Latina to serve as the Speaker of any state house, and 400 other elected officials across the state, is because they recognize my deep commitment to civil rights. I started my career in many ways at the Southern Poverty Law Center when I moved to Montgomery, Alabama to join the fight against the Ku Klux Klan and neo-Nazi groups. I designed and supervised an undercover investigation of employment discrimination for a state civil rights agency. I will continue to surround myself with people who bring different perspectives and different experiences and remind me that I don't have the answer to every question.
Well, and on that note, let me ask you both, have you had a conversation with people who protested the death of George Floyd? But speak to us now, not as a politician, but as a person here. What did you learn about yourself from what we are going through right now? Mr. Romanoff, you first.
I've not only spoken to folks who are protesting the murder of George Floyd, I participated in those protests myself as recently as this weekend for an early Juneteenth celebration. And hard to celebrate when we recognize, as I learned, that we have so far to go. This nation was founded, in the words of Ta-Nehisi Coates, on the torture of black fathers, the rape of black mothers, and the sale of black children. That's one of the reasons these protests are so urgent and the pain is so deep. I recognize I have not done enough. Despite the work I did at the Southern Poverty Law Center and the State Civil Rights Agency, despite my efforts to ban racial profiling as a member of the state legislature, or to increase the enforcement of our civil rights laws by boosting funding for the Colorado Division of Civil Rights, it's pretty clear that I have not done enough, that none of us has done enough, and that our obligation should entail continued efforts, not just to put more laws on the books, but actually to enforce them as well.
So that's what you learned about yourself, is that you haven't done enough.
Absolutely.
Okay. Mr. Hickenlooper?
So I also went to just a protest last week with my son. We were separate, and I stayed to the perimeter. But we did kneel for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. And that is a profoundly long period of time when you're in such a solemn occasion with 1,000 other people also kneeling, and recognizing that process of kneeling took George Floyd's life. I am overwhelmed by the places where we had tried to address the disparity in maternal mortality, and infant mortality is double in the black community than it is in the white community. But I felt that I just hadn't done enough, that I hadn't pushed myself and my team to get as much done as we should have.
Gentlemen, thank you. All right, we are going to take a break. We will regroup and we will be back here shortly.
I'm Mike Nelson. Another hot, dry day coming up Wednesday, and then some very nice changes coming our way as we get into Thursday and Friday. The storm threat for the next 24 hours, as it's been lately, lightning and strong winds from thunderstorms, little in the way of heavy rain or hail. That may switch a little bit later in the week as some cooler and more humid air comes in, but the cooler weather will certainly be welcome. Here are the weather makers across the country. We have a front coming our way from Utah and Wyoming. That's going to bring us some cooler air for the end of the week. There is a slow-moving system out on the East Coast that's been dropping heavy rain over the Carolinas, Virginia, up into Maryland, around Washington, D.C. Hot and dry air coming in from the desert Southwest. The front to our north is going to slowly approach. It will not get through here for most of the day Wednesday. Smoke and haze possible from the western fires, but dry early in the day Wednesday, and not all that cold. 70 for a low at La Junta. It'll be in the 60s over most of the eastern plains. 40s and 50s expected in the mountains. Front range numbers low to mid 40s up around Kremling, Grand Lake, Walden, mid 50s in the foothills, and low 60s along the I-25 corridor. Start with a little smoke and haze again in the mountains. A warm morning coming up. Hot and hazy by midday, but here comes that front late in the day, and that's going to bring isolated thunderstorms and cooler air, especially by the time we head into Thursday. Still hot, windy, dry with high fire danger over much of the eastern and southern portions of the state for one more day. Look at the temperature contrast. Behind that cold front, only in the 70s, Steamboat, Laramie, Craig, 100-degree temperatures. Pueblo, La Junta, Lamar, up toward Ray. Denver area, still another day in the 90s. But we'll have some very nice, comfortable weather coming our way as we get into Thursday. So here's your barbecue forecast. Hot and windy again Wednesday, but cooler and very pleasant weather Thursday. And on the 7-day forecast, we go from 92 to 75 to 73. And then see those temperatures back up to 78 Saturday. Father's Day looks nice with upper 80s and mostly sunny. Scattered afternoon storms return for Monday.
And welcome back, everybody. We are talking with Andrew Romanoff and John Hickenlooper, both Democrats who would like to be our next U.S. Senator. And so this question right now, gentlemen, is for both candidates, from a Denver 7 viewer named Krista De La Garza. And she asks, what is your stance on ICE? How will you help end the human rights crisis that immigrants are facing in our state and this country? And what will you do to end the era of children in cages? Mr. Romanoff?
Well, I believe we should dismantle ICE and assign its lawful responsibilities to more appropriate departments like the Department of Justice. I participated in protests outside the GEO facility in Aurora, the city where I live, and it is horrific to watch so many folks, not just in Colorado but across the country, see their families torn apart and, as you said, their children caged. None of these policies should come as a surprise. When Donald Trump descended the escalator in his tower to demonize Mexicans as rapists and criminals, to describe asylum as a hoax, to declare the country full. None of the policies that have followed should surprise anyone. But to be clear, the reason this president has been able to inflict so much damage on this country is in part because he finds allies like Cory Gardner at the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue, Senate Republicans who refuse to whisper even a word of dissent against this president's racism and immoral conduct.
Thank you. Mr. Hickenlooper?
Yes, ICE has been a miserable failure. They have taken a very difficult situation and made it into a crisis. I think we've got to immediately deal with the humanitarian crisis on our southern border and make sure that the resources are there to, again, deal with people humanely and make sure that they are not separated from their families, torn away from their mothers or fathers, put in cages or detention facilities. It's not American. It's the worst representation I've ever seen of this country to the rest of the world. I think we also have to recognize that ICE has become a menace in many of our cities. They try to compel the police to do their work for them and alienate the police from their local citizens. Very, very challenging situation for many of us. And Trump and Cory Gardner continue to promote this.
Well, would you both be in favor of eliminating ICE? Just a yes or no?
Yes. I'm not trying to eliminate it. I think I would reform it dramatically.
Thank you.
Sorry.
All right, this next question is for both candidates. Comes to us from a CPR listener named Claudia.
During your tenure as United States Senator, what specific actions will you take to arrest climate change sooner rather than later?
Well, I would start by ending the subsidies we provide for oil and gas and coal. We're spending about $650 billion a year in direct and indirect subsidies for the fossil fuel industry. We're effectively paying for pollution. I'd rather put that money towards solar and wind and other renewables. But if we're going to take that step, we also have to stop the fossil fuel industry from subsidizing Congress. At our debate last week, I challenged Mr. Hickenlooper to join me in rejecting contributions from the fossil fuel industry, turning down, in other words, the hundreds of thousands of dollars he's accepted over the years from oil and gas executives and their lobbyists. I know Cory Gardner hasn't taken that step. In fact, he is the second biggest beneficiary of fossil fuel money in the entire United States Congress. And it's no surprise. Senator Gardner sits on the Energy and Natural Resources Committee. So those industries have an interest in paying for his campaigns. The trouble is all of us get the bill. We've got to break this unholy alliance between the fossil fuel industry and the lawmakers who are supposed to be regulating it.
Thank you. Mr. Hickenlooper, same question to you.
Well, first let me say that we take no corporate PAC money of any kind, not from the oil and gas industry, for anybody. So just so we keep that perfectly clear. I view climate change as the single largest existential threat this planet's ever faced. I think we've got to have a fierce urgency. I've been working on it for 40 years, since I got a master's in 1979. I think we need to do a lot of what we started in Colorado, closing coal plants and not using coal to create electricity, creating transitions to electric vehicles. Fugitive emissions, we've got to capture all fugitive emissions. Methane is 80 times more harmful than CO2 to climate change. But we also have to look at the opportunities that come from innovation in agriculture and industry. When we try to cut those emissions, how do we make sure that we're getting the maximum benefit from those innovations? Because I think what's going to happen, it's not going to break the bank. I want to go to Washington. This is I want to change Washington around climate change and actually get things done, bring people together and focus on the opportunities and the outcomes of how we can grow our economy and get a cleaner energy economy at the same time.
I didn't actually hear an answer to the question I posed, so I'll try a third time. It's not just the corporate PAC money, Mr. Hickenlooper, I'm asking you to turn down. It's the contributions you take from fossil fuel executives and their lobbyists. And if you're serious about changing Washington, we've got to start by changing the way we finance our campaigns. Will you join me in that effort?
Well, Andrew, the bottom line is that you've taken contributions from oil and gas, people that work for them. And in 2014, I'm not aware that you gave them all back. I mean, we've had over 100,000 donations. I'm sure there's a computer that we can do that to figure out who those people are. But I guarantee you the number of oil and gas industries that are supporting me. Remember, I'm the one that got the oil and gas industry, compelled them to create methane regulations. They're spending $60 million a year. I'm not sure I'm their favorite son.
All right, gentlemen, we're going to move on for this next round. Thank you. Each panelist will spend some time asking questions to one candidate. So we're going to start with Ryan Warner and Mr. Hickenlooper.
Thanks, Ann. So, Mr. Hickenlooper, a 2014 video of you surfaced Monday, likening the life of a politician to the life of a slave, with whips and ships. More recently, you were asked what Black Lives Matter means, and you answered with All Lives Matter. And during the last debate, you referred to George Floyd's shooting. Are you out of touch with this moment in America?
Well, let me say that the comments I made in 2014 caused pain, and I deeply regret them, and I've apologized for them. And I've stepped on my own words around Black Lives Matter. Black lives matter. There is a time where we have to step back and recognize that slavery is a nagging, persistent shame of this country that's denied the promise of equality for far too long to too many people. And it's not just in police reform, it's in housing, it's in healthcare. Look at COVID-19 and how disproportionately African Americans were stricken. It's around education outcomes. It's around jobs and opportunity. I want to go to Washington, and I want to be part of the group that changes Washington and actually makes this country what its values say it should be, equal under the law.
I'd like to take a question from a CPR listener now for you, Mr. Hickenlooper. This is John Alfeld of Denver.
Why was running for the U.S. Senate your second choice? Thank you.
I can't, am I supposed to see this on? I don't see it on the screen.
You weren't able to hear the question?
No.
Okay. The question was, why was running for the U.S. Senate your second choice? Making reference first to your presidential race.
There's no question that I have bad-mouthed the U.S. Senate as a place that's broken and for people that want to get things done, a difficult challenge. But at a certain point, you have to decide whether you're going to be content to sit on the sidelines or you want to get in the ring with the mud and the sweat, as Teddy Roosevelt said, and be part of the change. And I want to go to Washington and be someone who can change not just the Senate, but change Washington. And I want to be able to address climate change aggressively and comprehensively. I want to deal with the education challenges we have. I want to deal with social and racial justice. And to do that, again, we've got to get Mitch McConnell out of the majority seat. I've got to beat Cory Gardner. I can't wait to beat Cory Gardner. I'm so ready to do this. I'm more passionate about this than any campaign I've ever had in my life.
I'd like to follow up because in January, you told me, speaking of a Senate run, this was January of 2019, you said, quote, most senators don't become even the vice chair of a reasonably important committee until your third term. Do those comments mean that you don't think you'd get much done early on?
No, just the opposite. I don't have any illusions that I'm going to suddenly become the chair, and that's not my goal. What I did when I was a mayor, what I did when I was a governor, what I did when I was a small business owner building restaurants in an abandoned warehouse district in Denver, I was able to get people together who often didn't like each other and get them to find common ground and create compromise. You know, I learned in the restaurant business that, you know, I've never changed anybody's mind about anything that mattered by telling them why I was right and why they're wrong. Where you get progress is when you hear people. In the restaurant business, we repeat back their exact words when they're angry so they feel validated. And that's how we got the oil and gas industry to work with the environmental community to create the first methane regulations in the country, rolled out as national policy in Canada and the United States until you know, President Trump and Cory Gardner's support rolled it back. That's what I want to do. I want to bring people together and change Washington and the Senate.
Thank you, Mr. Hickenlooper. All right, let's move on. Justin Wingirder and asking Mr. Romanoff questions now.
Thank you. Mr. Romanoff, you have not held office in 12 years, and you have lost your last 2 elections. Do you want political power more than Coloradans want you?
Well, I guess people will have to decide that pretty soon. Look, there are plenty of ways to make a difference outside of office. I spent the last 4 years, as I mentioned earlier, as the president and CEO of a group called Mental Health Colorado, fighting for families just like mine who have suffered from mental illness or drug addiction or suicide. I took that job, as you know, Justin, because I lost someone I loved very much in my life to suicide 5 years ago. One of the things I learned outside of public office is that all the laws in the world are useless unless you actually enforce them. And I'll just give you one quick example. I'm proud to have voted for laws that require insurance companies to provide equal coverage for mental health and physical care. But that law doesn't work right now because too often people who face a mental health or substance use disorder are forced to go out of network more often, wait longer, travel farther, pay more, or go without care altogether. That's not just wrong, it's literally illegal. And I want to have a hand in fixing that problem inside the U.S. Senate, just as I've tried to do in Colorado.
Thank you. This seat is very important to Democrats, though. I mean, considering your track record, why should Democrats think you can win in November?
Well, I'm proud to have led the Democrats in Colorado to our first majority in 30 years, our first back-to-back majorities since 1960. That's how I became Speaker of the House and got recognized as one of the most effective legislative leaders in America. It's true that I'm not the darling of Washington. I don't have these power brokers or party bosses in D.C. on my side. But as I mentioned earlier, we've earned endorsements now from about 400 county commissioners, mayors, school board members, city council members, and legislators. And not all of them are Democrats. You can't win a race like this or represent a state like ours just by preaching to the choir. Some of the endorsements that make me proudest in this race come from the other side of the aisle. The minority leader of the House, a Republican from Parker named Mike May, sent me a text not long after I joined this race. He said, "My wife and I would like to support your campaign for the U.S. Senate." I said, "Well, thanks, Mike, but I'm a Democrat." I just wanted to remind him. And he said, "I know that." But then he said this, "My country matters more than my party, and we would be honored to call you our senator." We're going to win this race by building a coalition just like that.
In 2003, you co-sponsored a resolution in the legislature that praised President George W. Bush for launching the Iraq War. Can you explain your reasoning?
Well, that's actually not just what the resolution did. It certainly praised the Commander-in-Chief's leadership. It also thanked the troops for their sacrifice and for their service. And that invasion clearly was a mistake. The legislature didn't have the authority to send troops into harm's way, but we did have an obligation, at least as the legislature saw it, to recognize the sacrifice that our troops were making and to send that message to Washington.
That resolution said Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. Did they?
No.
Republicans say you are a socialist who wants to drastically increase the size of government. Are they wrong?
It's not just Republicans who are making that attack. It's my friend John Hickenlooper on the stage. Look, this is the kind of tired demagoguery that has set our country back for decades. The Republicans made the same attacks on Harry Truman when he proposed a national health insurance plan back in 1945. They repeated those attacks 20 years later when Medicare and Medicaid were signed into law. They certainly repeated the same attacks when President Obama initiated the Affordable Care Act, and even now when we're trying to negotiate deeper discounts in the price of pharmaceuticals. We're not going to beat Cory Gardner simply by parroting his talking points. What we ought to do instead is make the case for health care for all, for an economy that works for everyone. And we ought to challenge those, Democrats and Republicans, who demonize these plans by asking them what they would make of Medicare itself, or Social Security, or public education, or infrastructure. Those are places where we've decided as a country that we ought to invest our scarce resources in a public sector. I think that makes you an American.
Would your policies increase the size and role of government?
Well, in the case of the climate crisis, I think we're spending too much right now on pollution. I mentioned earlier the need to cut the subsidies we're providing for oil and gas and coal. In the case of healthcare, I think we're spending too much money subsidizing the for-profit insurance and drug companies. I want to actually cut our nation's healthcare bill in half. And I'll just pause on this point because there's a real difference in this race, not just in the general election where I'm hoping to face Cory Gardner, but in the primary as well. There are not a lot of politicians outside of the United States tonight campaigning on a promise to bring their constituents American-style health insurance. And it's not because we don't have some of the best doctors and nurses and facilities in the world. We do. It's because the system itself is not the most efficient. So the plan I support, the same plan that Cory Gardner and John Hickenlooper and the insurance industry oppose, would strengthen Medicare by adding benefits for dental and vision and hearing and long-term care, increase reimbursement rates, especially for rural providers, and then lower the age of Medicare eligibility to 0. That, to my mind, is the best way to get to universal coverage.
Thank you.
Right, gentlemen, thank you. We want to get to another quick yes or no round. So, should doctors have legal protection if they refuse to treat transgender patients? Yes or no?
No.
No.
We're waiting on the Supreme Court to decide the future of DACA. Should DACA dreamers be given citizenship? Yes or no?
Yes.
Yes.
Do you favor increasing Social Security benefits?
Yes.
Cautiously.
Should the Broncos have signed Colin Kaepernick? We know they've been struggling, right? Should they have signed him? So yes or no?
You're
This is
outside
one
my
that-
depth. I don't. I haven't seen his tryout.
I'm going to leave that to the Broncos.
Yeah.
Okay, that's the shortest answers we've had. All right, thank you, gentlemen. We're going to pick up the one-on-one questioning again with Justin Wingooter.
Thank you. And Mr. Hickenlooper, our first question is from Lee Ellison in Thornton.
And I
We
can't
hope
hear.
you'll be able to hear this. Do we have that
We
question?
have Lee's
We're getting it.
question.
Over the last 3.5 years, we have had a lot of issues with officials at the federal level simply refusing to comply with requests or even subpoenas for information from Congress in order for them to manage accountability. That's why I was really taken aback when you refused to comply with a subpoena from the Ethics Commission. Why did you think it was okay to do that? And do you think that you are above the law? Thank you.
For the question, as you know, these were trips that I took while I was governor promoting Colorado. I've traveled anywhere and everywhere. I had offered to come testify fully and openly in front of the commission in person for a number of months. I wrote a formal letter in, I believe it was December. I was scheduled to testify in person in March, and then was at the last minute canceled due to COVID-19. I felt that my rights to due process constitutionally were more fair if I could testify in front of people with my attorney in the same room, and I was thinking we could wait another month. So we appealed, again, exercising constitutional rights, and the moment that we saw that their subpoena was upheld, I came in the next day. I testified. I was in front of that commission for 3 hours and answered every question openly. And they did find me in violation for 2 issues. One was, driving, flying. Sorry.
Just as a follow-up question, sir, you complain about the virtual format, but criminal defendants in the state use that format every day when their own freedom is at stake. Why do you play by a different set of rules?
Well, I wasn't intentionally trying to play by a different set of rules, and I was unaware of that. I thought the preliminary hearings were being done by video. So that's a fair point, and I certainly regret having caused the disruption in the time, and it had to come in a second day. The bottom line is, the point I'd like to make is that these were allegations from a dark money Republican group that was formed 2 days before they made the allegations. Of the 57 allegations, 2 were found to be violations. As I started to say, one was a trip for economic development where I paid the airfare, the hotel. I thought all the meals, but evidently there were some meals I missed in ground transportation. And then the christening of the USS Colorado. I take responsibility for these 2 violations. I respect the Ethics Committee. But again, remember, these are dark money attacks by Republicans who are going to attack me or whoever the Democrat candidate is.
Well, they're not going to attack me for breaking the state ethics law because I didn't. And I didn't defy a subpoena. I didn't get held in contempt. And I don't hold myself
Thank you, Mr.
above the
Romanoff.
law.
Thank you, sir. And back to you, Mr. Hickenlooper. While you were governor, you took those rides on corporate jets. Your office accepted large donations from corporations. As a candidate, you've accepted large donations from billionaires. Why should average Coloradans trust you will look out for them if you're elected?
Well, I think you're referring to the public-private partnerships. And public-private partnerships were used by the governors before me. They're a way that in times of financial stress, I came in one of the worst recessions in the last 100 years. And it allows the government to continue essential programs that would otherwise have to be cut. We see Governor Polis doing that right now with COVID-19 resources, many donations coming in. We added to the transparency. We really increased transparency in the portal so people could see who was giving. We made sure that every donor was on the portal, that they were recognized in press releases, they were on programs. We allowed 450,000 kids, 450,000 four-year-olds to get a book. For many of them, their first book. We allowed Pedal the Plains to show people on the Front Range where their food came from. We dealt with the consequences of the big flood in 2013. These were essential.
Thank you. Thank you. All right, let's move on to Ryan Warner, Mr. Romanoff.
Mr. Romanoff, in 2006, you helped lead a special session that was meant to crack down on illegal immigration. And recently, you referred to that as a grave mistake that will haunt you for the rest of your life. Who was hurt by that mistake and how?
Well, first, it's not just recently. I've spoken and apologized for this mistake for the better part of a decade. What we found was a governor, a Republican governor in this case, intent on putting on the ballot a constitutional amendment that would have stopped anybody in this state from getting any services other than those that were federally mandated. We were determined to stop that amendment from getting into the Constitution. So we adopted a statutory compromise. I wish we hadn't done that. I wish I hadn't done that. And I regret it, as I've said, because it has had consequences for folks who couldn't get some of the services that our requirements made mandatory. The requirements that we put in the state statute ban services that were already off limits under federal law. But I wish we had instead taken the risk and challenged the governor to call us back into special session, even if that meant risking a ballot fight over the constitutional amendment itself.
You support the Green New Deal, and the outline of that legislation guarantees any American a job who wants a job. Why is that the government's role?
Well, it is the goal of the government, in my view at least, to combat the mass unemployment that's ravaging our country. 40 million Americans out of work already, perhaps 50 million by the time we hit rock bottom during this economic downturn. So yes, I want to make sure that people have the jobs they need to support their families and pay their bills. We can do that if we're willing to take some inspiration from the original New Deal. FDR, after all, created a civilian conservation corps. We need a climate conservation corps, a modern CCC, to help us build a clean energy infrastructure, combat the climate crisis. Not all of these jobs, to your point, Ryan, are going to come from the public sector, but it seems to me we have an opportunity made necessary by this pandemic to lift our country out of the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression. And that's going to take bold leadership. Baby steps are not going to do the trick. It's one of the reasons I support the Green New Deal, and I'm disappointed that both Cory Gardner and John Hickenlooper oppose it.
You also support Medicare for All, but the presidential candidates who championed that lost the primary. Vice President Joe Biden, like Mr. Hickenlooper, wants to build on the existing Affordable Care Act. So help me understand, even if Democrats gain control of the Senate and the White House, how does Medicare for All happen?
In part because we actually present leadership in the U.S. Senate. Look, the Vice President has already adjusted his position on this issue. Vice President Biden has suggested he would be willing to lower the age of Medicare eligibility to 60. I'd like to take it down to 0. It's true, that won't happen as long as we elect folks, Democrats or Republicans, who oppose this plan. And I recognize this transition is not going to take place overnight. But it will never take place as long as the insurance industry and the drug companies continue to bankroll Congress and block reform. I'd like to be part of changing this system. I've met so many folks across Colorado who are struggling and suffering and losing their loved ones, their savings, their homes, their jobs, at a time when we should be able to say to them, your health insurance should not depend on your job, especially if you're forced to lose your job or change a job or you want to start a new business of your own. Your health insurance should come with you. That's the advantage of a program like Medicare for All.
All right, we're going to take some viewer questions now. And one of the questioners asks, in this era of partisanship, will your loyalty be to the party or to Colorado? And Mr. Hickenlooper, we'll let you begin.
Well, I've been in public life a long time now, 16 years, and my loyalty has always been to the people of Colorado. I can't wait to go to Washington and really get to work getting things done. So much of the problem in Washington right now, and Trump just is exaggerated beyond belief, but it's people digging in around partisan lines. When I first got elected mayor, the suburbs hated Denver. and Denver hated the suburbs. And I ran on a platform that was going to raise everyone up. And I got 2/3 of the vote. People are ready for people to work together. Now, I have no illusions about Mitch McConnell suddenly turning over a new leaf and not clinging to power with every moment. But I do think that just as we did with the oil and gas industry and the environmental community, very difficult negotiations, but we created the first methane regulations in the country. Those are the kinds of collaborations I want to bring to Washington, that willingness to get compromise and create progress.
Mr. Romanoff.
That's an easiest question that you've asked today, I think, because my loyalty is plainly to Colorado. I don't take money from special interest groups. I don't take orders from Washington. I recognize that the party bosses in D.C. who recruited John into the race, even though he told them he'd be a terrible senator and hate the job, have bankrolled his campaign. And I recognize that the approach I'm taking, a grassroots, people-powered, PAC-free retail campaign, doesn't sit well with some of the same folks in D.C. But to be perfectly blunt, I don't care. I'm not running to turn the Senate cloakroom into my own little private country club. I'm in this race and in this fight because I know too many folks in Colorado who feel like their voices are drowned out by the kind of pay-to-play politics that's corrupted Congress and soured people on even participating in the process itself. When I win this seat, it will be in spite of the opposition of my own party leadership in Washington, and instead because of the support we're getting all across Colorado from people logging on to andrewromanoff.com.
Warren wrote in, he wants to know, what makes you think that either one of you can beat Senator Gardner? Mr. Romanoff, I'll let you start.
Well, I think I've got the best chance to beat Cory Gardner for a number of reasons, not only because of the broad network of grassroots support we've built all across the state, not only because of my own record of legislative leadership and the work I've done outside the legislature as the president and CEO of Mental Health Colorado, but also because I have demonstrated a willingness, even by running, to stand up to my own party. And I think that's what Coloradans want to know. When the going gets tough, are you willing to stand up to your own team when your constituents or your conscience demands it? I'm doing that right now by defying the orders that are being handed down from Washington. I also have experience, the only person on this stage, debating Cory Gardner. We spent 4 years in the State House together. I got to know him really well. I happen to disagree with him on every major issue of public policy that I can think of. And I'm really looking forward to debating him in the fall. The trouble is, in this race, Mr. Hickenlooper, despite his appearance tonight as the ballots are arriving, has skipped 21 of our candidate forums so far. We deserve a senator who will show up and answer questions. It shouldn't take a subpoena to make that happen.
Thank you. Mr. Hickenlooper, I'll let you respond to that.
Andrew, half of those were before I even got into the campaign.
That is not correct.
The bottom line is I can't wait to run against Cory Gardner. And, you know, I ran statewide in 2010 and 2014. Very difficult years for Democrats. And I won statewide each time. Andrew, you haven't won yet statewide. I look at those two victories. I haven't, inside the state of Colorado, I haven't lost yet. And Andrew hasn't won an election in 14 years. There's a reason why the Republicans right now are spending $1.5 million or $2 million a week attacking me. It's not because they want to run against me. It's because they don't want to run against me. They want to run against Andrew. So they're interfering, and Cory Gardner's interfering in our primary. Hopefully our voters will go to hickenlooper.com as well as to the alternative site and sign up and help us make sure we push back against this Republican interference.
All right, gentlemen, the time is flying by. We have agreed to give each candidate 60 seconds for closing statements. Now's the time for that. So, Mr. Romanoff, we will start with you.
I want to say, first of all, thank you for giving us the opportunity to share some thoughts with you tonight. Look, this is a job no one is entitled to hold. It's the kind of job you have to earn. I'm trying to do that one phone call, one Zoom conversation, one candidate forum at a time. We can't knock on doors during this pandemic, but we have built a broad grassroots campaign. You're welcome to join at andrewromanoff.com. We don't have the most money in this race, but there is something profoundly broken about a system that simply sells Senate seats to the highest bidder. As long as we continue to do that, to put public offices up for sale to some of the nation's most powerful special interest groups, we will narrow the pool of candidates who run, narrow the pool who win, and warp the decisions they make as a result. Our campaign is built on a set of progressive values, and my support for a Green New Deal, for Medicare for all, for an economy that works for everyone, We need to reform our broken immigration system, reduce gun violence and this problem of police brutality, and change the way we finance campaigns themselves.
Thank you, Mr. Hickenlooper.
Well, thank you for tonight. And these are tough times, but Colorado's always been up to the test. When I was governor, we faced natural disasters, mass shootings, the Great Recession, but by working together, we always came together, and we built back better than we were before. We went from 40th in job creation to the #1 economy in the country. Now the dysfunction in Washington has helped to create the worst pandemic and the worst recession in a century. If we want to change healthcare, if we want to tackle climate change, if we want to create jobs with justice, if we want to build back better than we were before, we have to change Washington. We have to. Now, Cory Gardner has shown by supporting Donald Trump 100% of the time, he's not going to do it. But I believe together, working together, you and I can. So mark out your ballot and make sure you get it into the mail as quick as you can.
Thank you. You both are amazing with timekeeping. All right, 60-second answers. And we just want to say, we're not done, all right? Stay right there, but we do thank you for staying with us for this last hour on television. We will continue for the next 30 minutes. And we have a list for you on CPR News, on CPR.org, and streaming on the Denver Post Facebook page. You can, of course, also find us on the Denver 7 streaming apps for Roku, Apple TV, and Amazon Fire. More importantly, don't forget to vote. June 30th is when your ballots are due in. And if you're already watching our stream, we will be right here. We're not moving far from Studio A here at Denver 7. We will pick things up back, here in about 20 seconds. Be right back. Colorado Senate Debate 2020 continues on here in the Denver 7 studios. I'm Ann Trujillo, along with Ryan Warner and Justin Wingirter, and of course the two candidates who want to be your next U.S. Senator from Colorado, John Hickenlooper and Andrew Romanoff. And Ryan, I'll let you take over.
Thanks, Ann. You know, it strikes me that if either of you is elected, it will mean both of Colorado's U.S. senators come from Metro Denver. I'd like you to name an issue unique to rural Colorado that you'd like to address. Mr. Hickenlooper, if you'd like to begin.
Well, you know, when I first started out as governor and made a commitment to take us from 40th in job creation to try and be the #1 economy, and U.S. News and World Report has ranked us the #1 economy for the last 3 years. Part of my commitment, we went to all 64 counties, was to make sure that we didn't leave the rural parts of Colorado behind. I spent a lot of time on the Eastern Plains, a lot of time in the high country and on the far west slope. I think I've gathered gathered the information necessary to understand those economies. And you know, one of the things I'm very proud about, even though we've been the #1 economy, we've been one of the top rural economies in the country. And we've expanded broadband to, by the end of this year, and maybe won't quite make the end of the year, but we'll have broadband in every city and town. We gave tax incentives for small businesses to open in rural, underserved parts of the state. When we expanded Medicaid, we got into the rural areas. I have a passion about making sure that that gets distributed to everyone.
I'd like just 30 seconds for a follow-up, Mr. Hickenlooper. You say a lot about moving the state up in job creation when you were governor. In that same time, Medicaid also expanded greatly. Doesn't that demonstrate that the jobs added didn't pay enough for people to afford health care? Can you square those two parts of your record for me?
No, we changed the qualifications for Medicaid. So those weren't new people that came in and were qualified. These were people that were previously ineligible, and we made them eligible. Expanding 400,000, adding 400,000 to Medicaid, I mean, a disproportionate amount of those in newly insured people were in rural areas. We kept 8 rural hospitals open when we expanded Medicaid. It was a great boon to the rural areas.
And Mr. Romanoff, this question of a priority for rural Colorado, given that if you were to win, both U.S. senators would hail from Metro Denver.
I've spent the better part of 27 years, Ryan, traveling across the state, not just as a candidate, but as the minority leader, as the Speaker of the House, as the President of Mental Health Colorado, and in other capacities. And to my mind, at least, your ability to access education and health care, the internet, a good job, should not depend on your zip code, or for that matter, the value of your parents' property. That's one of the reasons that I teamed up with Kerry Kennedy, then our state treasurer, to create the largest investment in school construction in Colorado history, a $1 billion plan called BEST, to invest in the repair and rebuilding of rural schools. Today, there are 525 new schools and school projects in some of the lowest income communities in rural parts of our state as a result of that bipartisan effort. We're not there yet when it comes to access to high-speed broadband internet. I can tell you, if you spend any time in rural Colorado, you know it is the lifeline to the modern economy, like the railroads were in the 1800s or the highway system was in the middle of this century. And I want to make sure that the jobs and schools and healthcare of the future can travel to every part of our state.
Thank you. Justin, your turn.
Thank you. I have a question from a Denver Post reader, Stefan. I believe we're on Mr. Romanoff first. Our country spends more on the military than the next 10 countries combined. Do you support reducing the defense budget, and if so, by how much?
I do think the military budget should be under the same scrutiny as the rest of the federal budget, and reductions are appropriate for the reason that this question reflects. Look, I listened with interest to General Mattis, President Trump's Secretary of Defense at the time, when he opposed cuts to the State Department budget. He said, if you cut the budget for diplomacy, you're going to have to buy me more bullets. Clearly, it is cheaper and smarter and wiser for us to engage in diplomacy and international development and peace than for us simply to arm ourselves to the teeth. One of the reasons that we haven't succeeded in putting the Pentagon budget under scrutiny is in part because of what President Eisenhower warned us about, the military-industrial complex, which has figured out pretty quickly that bankrolling members of the Armed Services Committee in Congress is one way for it to withstand those cuts. Another example, I think, of the pay-to-play politics that's corrupted both parties, I'm sad to say, in Washington.
One follow-up, if I may, quickly. The military-industrial complex, as you may call it, covers a lot of jobs here in Colorado, up and down the Front Range. How would you cut the defense budget and make sure that those jobs here in Colorado are not lost?
You know, it's a good question also with respect to the fossil fuel industry. So in both cases, you're right. Colorado has created a lot of jobs, but in any transition, we have an obligation, at least in my view, to provide assistance and training and support as people take jobs in new industries. When it comes to the fossil fuel industry, for example, there are twice as many jobs to be had in renewable energy and energy efficiency as there are in oil and gas. But that means we've got to help smooth the transition. I don't want to treat anybody in our military industry or our fossil fuel industry as casualties of this transition.
Mr. Hickenlooper, sorry for the delay in getting to you. Do you support reducing the defense budget?
Well, I believe that we are long overdue for a comprehensive analysis. Historically, that's been done every, I think, 5 years or on some regular frequency. We're long overdue for that. I agree with what Andrew said, that we are at a point where, as a planet, I mean, transportation has gotten so fast, communication, all of our technology, we're so interconnected that we have to be dealing with each other, and it's essential to our defense. Look at the risk we face, climate change, what we do in this country, and we've got to get a plan together in Washington and execute it. I can't wait to be part of that. But we've also got to be willing to recognize we've got to get that globally. Same thing with cybersecurity. We have the National Center for Cybersecurity down in Colorado Springs, which I helped start. This is a time where we've got to negotiate with everyone. Pandemics. We need to talk to every country about every issue every day.
Thank you.
We have some Facebook questions that have come in. So this question is from Zach, and Zach asks, should Attorney General Barr be held accountable for authorizing the tear gassing of peaceful protesters for a photo op? Gentlemen? Mr. Hickenlooper?
Yes, I think that this is a classic case of a White House that has lost all regard for the people. And, Attorney General Barr has demonstrated again and again that he will do whatever President Trump desires. It appears sometimes he'll try to anticipate those desires. This was a case, and General Mattis's comments about this were profoundly disturbing. I mean, he was describing how never before in the history of this country have we had a president who not only fails to unite us in our time of crisis, but intentionally, consistently tries to divide us. And I think William Barr has been a large part of that effort and has, again, on every level, provided legal support for those efforts.
So he should be held accountable in...
Yes.
How would you see that happening?
Well, the Attorney General is the head of the federal justice system. So obviously the Senate and the House would have to re-examine the entire office of the Attorney General.
Thank you. Mr. Romanoff.
I believe General Barr should be held accountable. In fact, I believe he should be removed from office, not simply for this act, accommodating the president's request to use tear gas and rubber bullets on peaceful protesters, all to stage a photo op, but for the abuse of office he's conducted throughout his administration. The truth is, the Attorney General in the Trump administration acts as the president's personal lawyer. That's not the way this department is supposed to conduct itself. It's also worth pointing out, of course, that if more, or frankly any Republicans in the U.S. Senate actually stood up to Donald Trump, rather than just Mitt Romney, who voted to convict him on one count of impeachment, if Cory Gardner or any of his colleagues in what's often called the invertebrate caucus of the U.S. Senate actually took on the president and found their spine, we would not see so many members of the cabinet and the president himself continue to abuse the offices and violate the oaths they've taken.
Well, then, using your words, finding their spine, how will we know that either one of you as a junior senator going in would have a spine and be able to even affect change?
Well, you can look at what I'm doing right now. I don't want to get too far into the weeds here, but the truth is Coloradans need to know why we're running for this job. I'm not running to do the bidding of the political corporate establishment in Washington, D.C. I recognize that doesn't make me popular with some of the folks in the Senate Democratic leadership. As I mentioned before, that is not my concern. So when the Constitution or my conscience or my constituents demand independence from my own party, I am ready, willing, and able to exercise that independence. It is a promise, one of 1,000, that Cory Gardner has broken. When he ran for this seat in 2014, he said famously, "When my party is wrong, I'll say it. When something is broken, I'll fix it." He has broken that promise time and time again. As the president himself said when he embraced Cory Gardner at the rally they held together earlier this year, he said, "Senator Gardner has been with us 100% of the time. He's never wavered." The president meant it as a compliment. I take it as a big part of the problem.
Mr. Hickenlooper, I'll let you answer that question too.
Repeat the question again.
Mr. Romanoff used the word of having a spine, and so you as a junior senator, how will you show how you have a spine going to the Senate when, as a junior senator, you don't have really any clout?
Well, but you may not have clout, but you have a voice. And I think that the Senate provides a crucial check and balance to the White House. And as Andrew points out, the Senate really hasn't done that. And I'm not a lawyer, and I don't know exactly what the legal processes are by which you would craft legislation to make sure that the Attorney General, I don't know whether you would need to have term limits or whether you would have a way to compel him not to be the personal lawyer of the president, but to do the will of the people. Some people suggested that we have the Attorney General elected, like we do in Colorado, and Phil Weiser is our Attorney General by a vote of the people. I think it's it's better to keep let the Attorney General system, the structure stay the same, but change it so that and make those additions so they can't be the personal pandering attorney for the president.
Ryan?
Thanks, Ann. You both see climate change as an existential threat, but only one of you is calling for a fracking ban, and that's Mr. Romanoff. So tell me why a fracking ban is not part of your platform, Mr. Hickenlooper, and then Mr. Romanoff will hear your view on a fracking ban.
Well, as I've said, I view climate change as the greatest existential challenge we've ever faced. We have to have a fierce urgency in getting to net zero carbon emissions. We've got to transition away from coal and into wind and solar and batteries. We've got to transition to electric vehicles. I mean, I've laid it out on our website at hickenlooper.com. You can go see it all. I want to make fracking obsolete. Twice it was communities tried to ban fracking, and the Colorado Supreme Court found it unconstitutional. But that doesn't mean we can't make it obsolete. And my goal is to go out. We're closing 2 coal plants down near Pueblo right now, and they're going to be replaced by wind, solar, and batteries. And I believe for the first time in the country, the monthly electric bills for the customers isn't going to change. It might even go down. That's how we get the power of markets to accelerate climate change.
If I could just have
to accelerate our response to climate
change. If I could just have 30 seconds to follow up. You want to make fracking obsolete, but you aren't calling for a fracking ban. Is it your contention that that would be illegal? A fracking ban would be seen as a taking in Colorado, or what?
Yes, that is what the Supreme Court has ruled, but it doesn't mean we can't address it in other ways. In other words, if we're able to have the backbone, as Andrew says, we can, in real time, transition away from coal, transition away from oil and gas, and move into this new world of renewable energy, wind and solar, hydrothermal, and at the same time save money and drive the economy.
Mr. Romanoff, do you want to address this idea of legality specifically, and then the fracking ban writ large?
Well, if it's the Supreme Court that's tying your hands, you can amend the state constitution. I've sought on occasion to go to the ballot and make those changes with respect to the state's budget. So to me, at least, we ought to recognize not just that this is an existential threat or that we feel a fierce urgency, but rather that we have an obligation to take the action we've ignored for decades. If we were having this conversation, say, 40 years ago, when Jimmy Carter was installing solar panels on the roof of the White House before Ronald Reagan tore them off, we could afford to indulge the sort of incremental approach that other candidates are proposing. But it's too late for that. We've run out the clock. And look, the oil and gas workers in this state understand it. They can see the market shifting towards renewable energy. Their question to me, at least one group I met with during this campaign, was not whether the climate crisis was a hoax, because unlike the president, they know it's not, but instead whether we would help them get the jobs they need in the clean energy economy. My answer to them, our answer to them, has to be yes, instead of treating them like collateral damage.
Thank you. Justin.
Thank you. If you are a senator next year, how many town halls will you hold? I think we're on Mr. Romanoff first.
Yes.
I've tried to demonstrate in the course of this campaign exactly how accessible and responsive and transparent I will be. So we will hold hundreds of events, online or in person, as the technology and the pandemic allow. Just as we've done throughout this campaign over the last 16 months, we've met with folks in coffee shops, in brew pubs, in backyards, and living rooms. I told people I was available for weddings and bar mitzvahs. Really, anytime you want to get a group of people together, I'm all in. I know that Mr. Hickenlooper took issue with my count, so we'll provide a record of the 21 candidate forums that he's missed since he joined the Senate race. As I mentioned earlier, we already have a senator who doesn't show up or answer questions. I'm glad that John is here now. I welcome him to this stage. But it seems to me if you can't be bothered to show up when you need something from voters, like their vote, why would we expect you to show up when you don't? I will be the most accessible senator that Colorado has ever had. I took the same approach as a state legislator, as Speaker of the House, and in a listening tour I conducted as the President of Mental Health Colorado throughout the state.
Mr. Hickenlooper.
Andrew, I've won statewide election twice. In every case, I went to every county and did multiple events in almost each of those counties. While in office, I would call it Dome on the Range after Governor Romer's nickname, to go out and take a number of cabinet members into different parts of the state to make sure that they could hear what people were concerned about. And, you know, it's easy to talk, you're going to do this or talk that. I want to go to Washington and be part, I want to be action, I want to be a doer, I want to be part of the change. And while I was governor, we helped close 2 coal-fired plants. We expanded health care coverage for 500,000 Coloradans. We expanded women's access to reproductive rights. We were the first purple state to get universal background checks passed. We went from 40th in job creation to be the #1 economy in the country for the last 3 years. I want to take that kind of success and represent Colorado in Washington to change it.
But do you pledge to hold a town hall next year, if you are a senator?
I will hold dozens and dozens of town halls, left and right. Yes, I'm sorry. I thought I was saying by example of what I had done where I had always done that. Yes, I will continue that practice.
Thank you.
All right, thanks. All right, let's go to another Facebook question. This one's from He Zhang, who asked on Facebook Live, where is our second stimulus? If you were in the Senate today, would you be looking at another stimulus package? And if so, who would benefit from that money? I think, Mr. Hickenlooper, you're first here.
Yeah, I think we do need another stimulus. And obviously, I want to be part of that change in Washington. You realize there are only 5 or 6 senators that have ever actually run a small business. And it's no surprise then that there's always a bias towards the tax cuts and the benefits in the stimulus program to the largest corporations. In the first CARES Act, there were something like 100 publicly traded companies. The LA Lakers qualified. I would focus on the truly small businesses. And I'm not talking about just less than 500 employees, less than 100, less than 50, and maybe those, and make sure that there's money available for those 5 and 10 person businesses. And I recognize that this stimulus package, it's got to cover a bunch of different things, but I think its heart and soul has to be the truly small businesses that, especially in Colorado, they're the heart of our economy.
Thank you, Mr. Romanoff.
Well, one of the reasons that families and small businesses have not been helped as much as some of the nation's biggest corporations is in part because those giant companies put politicians on their payroll. That's how they get to call the shots. So the beneficiaries of a second stimulus, which we need, ought to be the families and small businesses who are just trying to weather the storm. What they want to know is this: when we emerge from this pandemic, will they get health care that can never be taken away? I say yes, health care that does not depend on your job. My opponents in this race say no. They want to know, can we actually put millions of Americans to work through a Green New Deal, building a clean energy infrastructure? I say yes. My opponents in this race say no. I'm intent on building an economy that works for everyone. But if we're serious about that pledge, we need to build a government that works for everyone. We don't have a government like that right now. And I wish I could say it was simply the Republicans' fault, because I know it's fashionable to blame the other team, and they deserve their fair share. But Democrats too often have also been seduced by corporate cash.
Thank you. Ryan.
Mr. Hickenlooper, you grew up, I believe, in the Quaker faith. And yes.
You're with me. Okay. I'm sorry. Specific.
This question is for both of you. I want to note that you grew up in the Quaker faith. Mr. Romanoff, you are Jewish. And I wonder if you would each point to a teaching from your respective faith that helps you make decisions that you turn to in a difficult time. And indeed, Mr. Romanoff, you're first.
The central teaching of my faith, or at least one, is a notion expressed in Hebrew as tikkun olam. It means to heal the world. The suggestion that the world is a broken place and our obligation is to help repair it. That is the spirit that took me not just to the Southern Poverty Law Center, but to Nicaragua in the wake of a very brutal civil war that our own government here in the U.S. helped finance. I remember having a conversation with one of the students I taught at a little fishing village on the coast of Nicaragua. I had given my students an assignment. I asked them to tell me what they wanted to do when they grew up. One of my students began his essay by telling me instead what he wanted to do if he grew up. Not when, but if. Because growing up in Nicaragua and other parts of Central America was not a guarantee at the time. And it's still not for kids all over the world, including here in the United States. That, to my view, is unacceptable. We ought to be helping kids, whatever their background, fulfill their God-given potential, no matter where they are or where they come from.
Tikkun olam, to heal the world. Mr. Hickenlooper.
So first, my family was Quaker 3-4 generations ago, and I'm proud of that ancestry. Many of the Quaker oats cereal and all different kinds of Quaker products were because Quakers were so honest before you had accurate measuring and weight systems that they were trusted. But I was raised an Episcopalian. It is ironic that I married a Quaker and was married in a Quaker ceremony, but I never joined the Quaker faith, although I admire it tremendously. They believe God is within each of us. They don't have a minister get up and speak. They let each person stand and speak their spirit. As an Episcopalian, you know, when actually the Bible was pushed back to me, when I was trying to deal with the capital punishment, whether I was going to give the order to execute someone, and the fact that the entire New Testament is really focused on forgiveness, and that an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth is only in the Old Testament, really did have an impact on how I thought about the issue.
Thank you both.
Thank you. Justin?
Thank you. Mr. Hickenlooper, we'll start with you. On February 28th, you told myself and other reporters that you look forward to working with moderate Republicans and getting some stuff done in the Senate. Do you see that as naive?
Yes, I've been told that. I don't think it's naive. I think, again, I have no misconception about Mitch McConnell and what he cares about. As close as I can tell, all he cares about is maintaining his power and the stranglehold he has on progress in the U.S. Senate and the ability to pack our courts with a relentless flow of oftentimes inadequately trained and unqualified federal judges. But I do think, and I really want to take the challenge seriously, that we're going to elect enough Democrats to displace Mitch McConnell as the majority leader. And I believe there are, once we displace Mr. McConnell and President Trump, I think there are enough moderates out there, and I think there's going to be a groundswell of Republican voters and independent voters that are going to compel those moderate Republicans to listen and be part of positive change.
Mr. Romanoff, do you see that as naive? And if so, why go to the Senate if you can't work with other people?
Look, I went to the State House in a minority and led the charge to take over. I teamed up with friends like Alice Madden, who became our majority leader when I became Speaker of the House, to do what nobody thought possible, to bring a Democratic majority to Colorado, to Colorado's House of Representatives. I'd like to be part of the same effort in Washington. I hope I'll be serving in the majority when I get to the U.S. Senate and replace Cory Gardner in January. That might not be the case. And it would be great if we could find allies on the other side of the aisle, as I did here in Colorado. I just don't see a lot of evidence of that. As I mentioned earlier, Mitt Romney was the only Republican willing to defy Donald Trump and risk a tweet storm that followed. And it seems to me Cory Gardner has been so intent on keeping his job, he's forgotten his obligation to do his job. It's one of the reasons we should go help him find a new job.
Thank you.
And to that point, why should Colorado have 2 Democratic U.S. senators? We're a very purple state. That's a whole lot of leaving a lot of the state out. If we have 2 U.S. senators who are Democrats, what will you do to represent the independents, the Republicans of Colorado?
Well, I think you can see tonight that not all Democrats think alike. I'm not going to be a rubber stamp for my own party in Washington. I support proposals that the leadership of the Democratic Party in D.C. oppose. In fact, it's one of the reasons I suspect they recruited Mr. Hickenlooper into this campaign, because of my support for a Green New Deal and Medicare for all. I think reasonable people can differ about how we get from here to there, but we will never get there if we don't put these plans on the table. And to be clear, we haven't, in part because the fossil fuel industry has blocked climate action and allowed senators like Cory Gardner to gut our environmental laws, in part because the insurance companies and the drug industry have blocked not just consideration of Medicare for all, they've even demonized a public option. It would be naive, I think, to expect that we could somehow avoid those attacks simply by triangulating our way out of them. We should not, this is the key lesson to my view, should not start these negotiations at the 50-yard line, in part because too often we find ourselves negotiating against ourselves.
Thank you. Mr. Hickenlooper, why should we have 2 U.S. senators who are Democrats?
Well, I think we're faced with a situation here where President Trump has seen no restraint. Republican Senate, as we've discussed multiple times tonight, continues to empower his behavior that in almost every regard is against the tone and even the letter of our Constitution. I think that having 2 Democrats if you think about it, if the election goes properly, we'll have 2 Democrats from Colorado, 2 Democrats from New Mexico, two Democrats from Nevada, two Democrats from Arizona, and 2 Democrats from Montana. I think the Mountain West is becoming a voice for, responsible government and taking on things like climate change and making sure that universal health care is available at high quality at affordable cost to everyone. And those bread and butter issues are things that we know in the Rocky Mountain West. And I think the Democrats are demonstrating our commitment.
Thank you. Ryan?
You both have taken shots at Cory Gardner, who you hope to run against in the general. Is the Great American Outdoors Act a success for him? It's a bipartisan piece of legislation that certainly adds to public lands in Colorado. Mr. Hickenlooper?
Well, it is useful, and making sure that we get funding for the Land and Water Conservation Fund. These are important steps forward, but that doesn't relieve him of the responsibility to stand up for Colorado. We've attracted, we've become the center of the outdoor recreation industry, and they've now going to have a virtual conference. But we've attracted not just their conventions and conferences, but also their companies. And outdoor recreation is the perfect complement for the state of Colorado and our public lands. And why is it Cory Gardner won't support the CORE Act? Why has he supported Donald Trump's appointments to the EPA to roll back all the safeguards for clean air and clean water that we spent decades building up? The CORE Act, where we're going to protect 400,000 acres I mentioned, why can't he support that?
Gentlemen, thank you. All right, we're just about to.
Mr. Romanoff.
Oh, I am so
question.
sorry.
No,
I'm being the timekeeper here.
I
Your
don't mind
turn.
if you
Yes.
don't give me a chance to give Cory Gardner credit. It's really not what I signed up for. But the truth is, I'm not intent on just opposing everything that Cory Gardner's for. So yeah, I'm glad that he helped pass this law. I'm glad that he has taken action to allow marijuana businesses in Colorado and other parts of the country to use the interstate banking system. None of that, of course, makes up for the record he's acquired. When Cory Gardner ran for office in 2014 for the U.S. Senate, he promised to be, in his words, a new kind of Republican. He's turned out to be anything but. He was able to win that race in part because he was a bit of a blank slate. He had served 4 years in the U.S. House, but he smiled through every debate and never really let on about the kind of Republican he would be. A lot of Coloradans saw through it then, and even more, I suspect, do right now. We need a senator who will stand up to the fossil fuel industry instead of taking contributions from them, who will support a Green New Deal instead of opposing it, and will stand up to a president, even one of their own party, when their conscience demands it.
Thank you. We are going to wrap up with one last question from Justin, so take it away, Justin.
All right. These are politically divisive times, so say something nice to the guy at the other podium.
Well, John Hickenlooper has been a friend of mine for 20 years. I hope our friendship will survive this experience. I pledged when I joined this race 6 months before John got in to support the Democratic nominee, even if it turns out not to be me, and I want to maintain that pledge. I'll work just as hard to help him beat Cory Gardner should he become the nominee as I would if I were the nominee, as I hope to be.
And I appreciate that. And we've known each other for a long time. And when I first got into politics, Andrew was one of the first people who reached out and kind of welcomed me into a strange new environment. I am sure that we will maintain our friendship after this one way or the other. And I am also sure that whoever wins, we will work assiduously to make sure that Cory Gardner doesn't get a second term. Because, again, he supports the lawsuit to repeal the Affordable Care Act. I mean, it's crazy. But anyway, back to my appreciation. Couldn't let Cory Gardner off with one last jab. Andrew Romanoff has probably done as much as anybody in this state for mental health. And he spent 4 years putting his heart and soul, as he said, traveling the state. And I can tell you firsthand, mental health is a challenge for every state. And we're better off because of his work.
Thank you.
Well, on that very nice note, I just want to say thank you, gentlemen, for your time. I realize this was the first in-person debate, so again, we were monitoring our distance here very carefully. Everyone showed up in masks, and we appreciate that. And
Got my no-vote mask.
and put the voting mask back on. And thank you all for watching and participating and sending your questions in. And it's my honor to work with all of you. Thank you all.
Thanks, Ann. Thank you, John.
Thank you, guys. Appreciate it.